In this lecture, we're going to talk about Simone de Beauvoir's essay, Existentialism and Popular Wisdom. It's written around the same time as the last essay that we read, What is Existentialism? And also around the same time as Sartre's very famous lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism. So this is the time when existentialism is very popular in France and elsewhere. And a lot of people had questions. Well, what is it? What does it really mean? What could it mean for me? And Sartre and Beauvoir were interested in talking about that, but also talking about some misperceptions that people had about existentialism. So we're going to continue that conversation in the current lecture. So the question is existentialism negative? We already know about that. The argument's going to be that from Beauvoir, the response is going to be, well, all kinds of philosophies that we're all very well familiar with, what we'll refer to as popular wisdom, kind of what people know, what everybody says, what everybody thinks. There's a lot of negativity about us human beings in our own popular wisdom. So let's run down a list of some of the tenets of what Beauvoir referred to as popular wisdom. Existentialism is meant to restore to human beings a kind of dignity based in radical freedom that's going to be different from this list of the tenets of popular wisdom. So, for instance, number one, in public, she says, people are loath to note their own weaknesses, although in private they will. So when we get out in front of people, when we're, let's say, applying for jobs or in a social situation, we tend to play to our strengths. We talk about them. But when we get alone with other people, then we may, let our guard down. And so what does that show us? That, well, in public, we believe in some ways that we should not talk about the negatives of our own human existence, but it implies that they are negative, that we have something to hide, that only in private can we talk about these things. She said Christianity, which again was still very much culturally important and relevant in France and elsewhere around the Western world, Christianity sees human beings as bad, original sin. Human beings need the fear of hell and society and social practices and social disciplines and structures to contain us because we're bad. We could see this in other aspects of Western culture. Thomas Hobbes, the great English political philosopher, again, saw human beings as basically violent and bad and needing of society to rein us in. And Beauvoir saying, well, people complain about existentialism as seeing humans as negative. Well, what about Christianity? Secularists see human beings as innately selfish, acting purely from self-interest. The aforementioned Hobbes was not sympathetic to Christianity. He thought that human beings left to their own would create an environment that he said would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. People have described me that way sometimes. Well, anyway, because it would be a war of all against all. People would be selfish and be grabbing for everything that they can, and we act strictly from self-interest. Even someone is not as negative as like a John Stuart Mill and his philosophy of utilitarianism, which I'm sure you studied before in your ethics courses, saw people as motivated primarily by selfish pleasure. Now, utilitarianism is not a hedonism. It's not saying, well, whatever feels good, you should do it. You remember the principle of utility, act in such a way that you maximize happiness. Do the greatest good for the greatest number. But it's predicated on the idea that human beings are basically selfish in their desires, and we're just trying to find the greatest overall satisfaction level that we can. But it views us as selfish. And, people will accept selfishness and even cynical egoism, Beauvoir says, so long as we're not hypocritical about it. We could maybe look around today in the media and the newspapers to see examples of that. But she has a quote really from her own day. A triumphant Hitler would have surely incited much less outrage than a defeated Hitler. Think about that for a second. Think about what she's saying there, and think about whether you agree with it, right? Just because a philosopher says something doesn't mean that it's so, and it's one of the things that I always harp on. Our job is to try to, first of all, understand what the thinker is saying, and then we need to approach it critically. But she's saying that if Hitler had won, there would be somewhat more of a kind of acceptance of that kind of person, that kind of behavior, because they won. And people would say, well, that's, he's just, he's bad, but we're all bad, and it's working out, quote unquote, working out. So maybe it's not so bad. When he goes down, thank goodness, when he goes down, then we could, unleash on his, bad character and his bad ideas and his heinousness, and rightly so. But she thinks that, if people behave in a selfish and cynical way, so long as they're kind of on top, as long as they're kind of winning, and they don't pretend they're not that way, if they're just very straight, yeah, I'm selfish and that's it, and I do what I want and that's what I do, we're weirdly kind of okay with that until they lose. And then we have more problems with that. You could see that sometimes in popular culture and movies where the wise guy who's kind of selfish and arrogant and willing to do anything, we're okay with that person, so long as they're honest about themselves and they're winning, they're succeeding. But the minute they go down, then we're more than willing to say, see, look, he was a bad person. She also says that we're likely to just look at people's behavior and go, well, it's just human nature. It's never going to change. And she says that view takes human beings to be bad and irremediably bad in such a way that they're not going to be fixed. And she thinks that leads us to absolve ourselves from the guilt and responsibility that comes along from behaving as we do. We just say, oh, well, we can't help it. It's just human nature. That's just how we are. We're selfish, we're arrogant, we're egotistical, and that's just how we are. As if we couldn't be otherwise. It tends to treat human beings as mechanical, she says, or mechanistic, or even automatons. And she's going to say that existentialism does not look at us that way. Who's being negative now? Is she saying? What's the negative view of human nature? Existentialist view of freedom, or this view of humans as mechanical and they can't help it? This is a good one. Again, written 3/4 of a century ago almost. People allow comedians to make fun of them. I mean, we go to comedy clubs and comedians come out there, and my opinion, this is just my view, I think that in our world, our comedians, our best comedians, are also in many ways our best philosophers. They're our best truth seekers and our best truth tellers about ourselves. And if you watch a really good comedian, I'll just take one of my favorites, Dave Chappelle. If you don't feel a sting while you're laughing at what Chappelle does in his performances, then you're just not catching on. I mean, Chappelle and there's others that I can name that just have an ability to see our foibles and worse. See our really the bad side of us, and they present it to us in a way that's kind of amusing, so we laugh, but it's an uncomfortable laughter, and we bring that on ourselves. We go and pay money to hear people tell us that we're not perfect, that we're not so good. And maybe that makes us feel a little better, but it also is a recognition that we have a view of ourselves as somehow being, not so good. People are cynical about love relationships. A lot of times, we see a couple and we think, well, at least one of them, is after something, it'll never last. I'm not going to overshare, but when I was a young guy, my people would ask me like, oh, what are they in it for? Or more likely, friends of theirs would say, what do you think he's in it for? There's always, we don't take it at face value. We don't think, oh, two people just kind of found themselves and they're doing fine. We think somebody's after something here. And that she thinks that's, something, Beauvoir thinks that's something that shows up in our popular wisdom about ourselves. And if a couple does last, it's chalked up to a kind of laziness or a lack of imagination. There's a scene from one of Woody Allen's movies, Annie Hall, that I think illustrates this pretty well.
You look like a very happy couple. Are you?
Yeah.
Yeah? So how do you account for it?
I'm very shallow and empty, and I have no ideas and nothing interesting to say.
And I'm exactly the same way.
I see. Well, that's very interesting. So you've managed to work out something, huh?
Right.
Oh, well, thanks very much for talking to me.
Husbands and wives often are depicted as comic figures in art. I think we talked about this. We talked about Kierkegaard and the ethical life that Judge William, his character Judge William, finds in marriage, the height of a kind of a serious commitment to a world wherein there is good and evil, and then a choice of good. But he says that the stories we tell are about the romance. Our stories, the ones that we put into novels and plays and movies, are the ones that say, and they lived happily ever after. But we don't make art about the happily ever after. And if we do, the married couples tend to be in novels and in plays, especially of earlier times. They're sort of funny. Like, these people are comic. What are they doing together? How are they doing this? This is not that interesting, but that's what they do. So they're kind of just a relief from the real drama of life. And Beauvoir says, is that a really good positive view of human nature? She says that people really deep down don't believe in friendship. Now, again, I beg you, always read philosophers and ask yourself at every turn, okay, have I understood what she's saying, and do I agree with it? But she's arguing here, or at least indicating here, that not from her point of view, but from the point of view of her observations of people. That's what she's doing here, popular wisdom. She's not advocating for these views. She's saying this is the way people look at each other. And she says we don't really believe in friendship. She writes, a successful man feeling embarrassed when he happens upon a childhood friend who has sunk into misery. Oh, that was my childhood friend. They say, oh, yeah, it's good to see you again, childhood friend. And, oh, by the way, I just lost my job and I'm really kind of down on my luck. And then what do? We look at our watch and we kind of move on. You can see this, though. This idea is not new with Beauvoir. It's an idea that's addressed even by Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics more than 2,000 years ago, where he writes at line 1158b, 30 and following, he says, equality, however, does not appear to be the same in friendship as in justice. This is clear if friends come to be separated by some wide gap in virtue, vice, wealth, or something else, for then they are friends no more. Right? We were friends until we weren't, until something more important than friendship that we used to say so many good things about, something more important to us than friendship kind of gets in the way. And now that I'm doing well and you're kind of down your luck, that really kind of changes things. Love to help you. I love to hang out with you, but I've moved on here. And she says, again, people think this, not she's arguing this, but this is the way she says people look at us. We don't really share the joys and sorrows of others. We tend to, on occasion, when somebody has something really good happen to them, we don't always, show our great joy for their, good fortune. A lot of times we feel kind of bad about, like, why didn't it happen to us? And, they're always so lucky, and how did that happen? And, and then sometimes when others feel sorrow, we don't feel sorrow along with them. We feel, whew, boy, I'm glad that didn't happen to me. I better them than me. We don't always do that. At least that's the way she thinks people think about each other. Everyone loves to tell their own stories, but gets bored with listening to other stories. I don't know. Does that sting? Does that ring a bell? What she's saying there? In a prior position that I had, I helped to organize very large conferences of scholars and academics and so forth. And after one of those conferences, a person came up to me and they were trying to pay me and us, our organization, a compliment for the conference. But the person said to me, this is really pretty good, because normally when I go to these things, there's only two modes: talking and waiting to talk. Talking and waiting to talk. Like I wasn't here to really listen to what anybody else might have to say. I'm talking, and while they're talking, I'm thinking about what I'm going to say next. Now, think about our ordinary, normal interactions with each other. Do we really listen? Are we listening? Or especially in a social situation, maybe not between intimates so much, but in at a party or a social situation, are we having a communication, or are we just sort of talking and waiting to talk? Maybe. But again, Beauvoir's not arguing that this is the way it is or the way it should be. She's saying people know this. People recognize themselves in these points. This is popular wisdom, so to speak. This is what people think. This is not necessarily what she thinks, but what people think. And what she's trying to do is make a distinction between this popular wisdom and the way existentialism looks at us human beings. She also says that we all try to avoid ever needing anything from anybody. I don't know. Is that right? When people ask us, hey, how's it going? You need anything? Are we pretty quick to say, I don't need anything, even if we do? I don't know. But we like to feel like we don't need anything from it. We like to feel like we're self-contained, I think, and we're self-sufficient. We think this is important to us. And then she says, well, listen, if self-interest is true, all existence is a radical failure, for man's only goal is to assure his own happiness, and happiness is impossible. So she's making an aside here, in a way. Think about this. All these views of popular wisdom sees human beings as individuals and as trying at least to be self-sufficient, operating on their own self-interest at all times, and because we think our goal is to be happy, and we don't really think happiness is possible. Again, popular wisdom maybe doesn't think that it's possible. So there's something of a failure in our own self-understanding, according to this popular wisdom. We think of ourselves a certain way. We think of it because we want to be happy, and then we think happiness is not going to be possible. That seems like a recipe for misery. She's going to want to talk about this. She says, nothing is more disappointing than to obtain what has been desired. Everything passes, everything breaks, and everything grows wearisome. My mother likes to say that my first words were, gotta have it. I don't know, I was like a little tiny little kid, and I saw like a red rubber ball, and I pointed at it, and I barely had language, and I said, I gotta have it. I gotta, and weirdly, I've been saying gotta have it pretty much ever since, the rest of my life. And but think about when you're a kid. Isn't this the case a lot of times where we gotta have it? There's some new toy, there's some new thing, and maybe not just when we're kids either. Think of the new iPhone, and then the next new iPhone. We see something, we say, we got to have it. I absolutely have to have this. And we get all worked up until we, when we're kids, we're pestering our kids. The holidays are coming, and you're getting gifts, and, I got to have it. And it's, Christmas morning, let's say, and you're ripping open the packages, and you see this thing that you had to have, and you have it, and your mind is blown, and you're so excited. Where does that thing end up? 2 weeks later, it's in the back of your closet, and you're telling your parents, I got to have it. There's something new. I got to have it. Aren't we kind of like that? Even with our new stuff, with new clothes or new tech or whatever the latest new thing is. This reminds me, when we talk about it, of Kierkegaard's aesthetic life, the life of the aesthete, the one who looks at his or her life as a kind of like a work of art where the highest criterion is novelty, what's new, what's exciting. It's kind of like Heidegger's fallenness, when we're just beset by what he calls curiosity. We're just looking for the next new thing all the time. And maybe we recognize ourselves in that. Now, think about Heidegger for a second. Heidegger says we're like that because of our being in the world, and our being in the world is inauthentic. Our being in the world is constructed, molded by the they that we've talked about at some length. So existentialism may recognize, along with popular wisdom, that this is kind of the way we are. We want whatever's next, the next big thing. But existentialism recognizes the roots of that and where that comes and what about how those desires are satisfied. That's what existentialism is really talking about. So we may be finding some common ground in our observations about human beings between existentialism and popular wisdom, but there's more to it than that for the existentialists, as we'll see. So if all this is right, then she says people think that we fall into what she calls an ethics of mediocrity. Just keep your head down. Maybe you've heard this phrase: whoever sticks his neck out, gets his head chopped off. Just be respectable. Don't worry about being a hero or a saint or anything like that. Just stick to the middle of the road. In many respects, this is a misunderstanding of Aristotelian virtue ethics that says to aim at the mean between extremes. And if you happen to have talked about that book with me, I say there's a misunderstanding there that hitting that mean is not mediocrity. It's an excellence. It's as good as it gets. It's hard to do, and if you can do it on a regular basis as a matter of habit or disposition, that's great. That's not mediocre at all, and it's very rare. But people misunderstand it. They say, well, don't blow too hot or too cold. Just stick in the middle, be lukewarm. She thinks popular wisdom tends to teach us that. Don't stand out. Don't be careful when you take a stand. Just try to be respectable. And popular wisdom recognizes what the existentialists recognize, what you can't not recognize, that we die. So she thinks that some people pick up this idea that nothing really matters out of that. It leads to a kind of nihilism. And the view is, well, take it easy. There's no real objective value to anything, so you may as well take it easy. And now, you can really see how popular wisdom and existentialism are starting to dovetail here a little bit. We know that our existentialist thinkers are very aware of our finitude, of the fact that we're being towards death. What they don't take away from it is this conclusion that, well, just take it easy, nothing really matters, let's just be nihilists. In the end, everybody dies, so what's the point? That is not the teaching of the existentialists at all. But it may be something that comes into the mind of popular wisdom. What difference does it make? It all just goes away in the end. Maybe people think that, and existentialism does not want to teach that. She says, we tend to thinking about ourselves the way popular wisdom does, that we shrink away from definitive statements. We'll say something, but we won't go all in with the things that we say. So, for instance, she says on page 210 of this essay, people get scared when faced with an uncompromising opinion or a definitive truth. They will complacently list off someone's faults, saying that so-and-so is conceited, egoistic, mean, and greedy. But if you conclude that, well, he was a bad man, your interlocutor protests, well, I didn't say that. And he might add, in spite of everything, the core is good. In this way, man accepts being painted by cruel little brushstrokes, but if you force him to take a step back and contemplate his full-length portrait, he looks away. He does not want to summarize or conclude. Again, knowing a little bit, as we do, about the existentialist point of view here, we can see what an existentialist might say to this. If the ordinary person, so to speak, shrinks away somehow from the big conclusion, a finality, well, that's part of our makeup as Dasein. That's part of our makeup as a for itself or a freedom, the being whose being is possibility. We can't sum ourselves up. And we know that deep down. That's what Heidegger calls one of those examples of kind of a fore understanding that gets fleshed out by philosophy. We get that a little bit, that we're the being of possibility. We hide from that because there's great weight attached to that, but we recognize that. But in the popular mind, without really thinking this through, which is what Beauvoir is talking about here, the view that I don't want to make a definitive statement is I don't want to commit. I don't want to go all in with my views about the world. Now, she's not saying that, first of all, that she's endorsing this in some important way, but she's also saying, even if this is the way you look at people, she's not saying, it would be better if people were stubborn. They just made definitive judgments and then they just dug their heels in and stuck with those views that this person is bad and that's the end of it. She's not really saying that. She's talking more about a kind of everyday reticence to be fully committed. It's that ambiguity that she's going to make clear to us coming out in everyday life, that things aren't as clear-cut as we do get that. We just don't respond to that insight of existentialism as well as we might. And she's going to work with us about that. Everybody, she says, in the common view sees him or herself as the exception. I wonder if that stings a little bit when you hear that. She writes, people will say there's no more beautiful fate than to die for one's country, but I'm not going. You go. That would be beautiful. That's beautiful, noble, it's awesome, but not me. I'm not going. We do. We see ourselves as an exception. People ought to wear masks. Well, but not me in this particular situation. We always seem to recognize ourselves as an exception. And what's important to note about that is, in the existentialist point of view, each one of us is the exception. As the philosopher John D. Caputo would say, each one of us is the singularity, a singularity, that no two people are exactly alike. There's never been another you. There never will be another you. We tend to live as if we were interchangeable. That's that they self that Heidegger talks about. But Heidegger would agree. Dasein is in each case my own and only my own. Ontologically, that's the kind of thing that I am. So in an important sense, each one of us is exceptional. But that's not the way we play it in our bad faith. Our bad faith claims this is the way it is. Oh yeah, but it doesn't apply to me. That's the difference. That's what Beauvoir is pointing out here. She says that human beings fear responsibility above all. We would rather renounce our freedom than be responsible. Again, these are hard sayings. She's not necessarily endorsing that through and through, but she's saying people tend to look at each other, look at ourselves in this particular kind of way. We really want to say, look, I can't help you. It's not my fault. It came from upstairs. I'm just following orders. And I'd rather treat myself in a mechanistic way than be responsible for my life. Now, critics accuse existentialism of subjectivism, she says, but their own views rest on a psychology of immanence, What she means by that is, according to them, all projects and feelings turn back on oneself in the present moment, as if I'm a self-contained thing that has certain projects that just are what they are and self-justified in some kind of way, detaching me from all the rest of my fellow human beings and the world around me. She thinks that means that critics have a pessimistic view about us, a pessimistic view. But existentialist, she says, affirms that man is transcendence, that life is engagement with the world and with others towards a future that's open with possibilities. So she thinks that existentialists are optimistic. Now, you'll remember that in our discussion of the other essay, What is Existentialism?, Beauvoir raised problems for the whole dichotomy between pessimistic and optimistic. She's not changing her view here particularly, but what she's saying is, when she's calling the proponents of this popular wisdom and the critics of existentialism pessimistic, what she means by pessimism here is mechanistic, fated. We just are what we are, and that's just the end of it. When she uses the word optimistic here, she is not saying the future is absolutely going to be rosy, because she knows full well that it may not be rosy when people act in their freedom. What she's saying is, by optimism, that the future is open, that it's not locked down, that other things are possible and that we are these possibilities. So that she's not changing her view from the other essay, where pessimism meant negative and optimism meant, rosy outlook. Here, pessimism means kind of fated or mechanistic, and optimistic here means open to possibilities. Existentialism holds that people are neither naturally good nor naturally evil. Now, we saw a quote from Montaigne that she had in her last essay that said basically the same thing, but you could also compare to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, where he writes at 1103a 24, and so the virtues arise in us neither by nature nor against nature. Rather, we are by nature able to acquire them. That's a word of possibility. We are able to acquire them, and we are completed through habit, through developing those virtues in one way rather than another. We construct ourselves as we go. I mentioned before Heidegger's being in time, which really is the bedrock of this existential analytic that we've been working through, is a kind of a rewrite of Aristotle, especially the Nicomachean Ethics. So here we're seeing it again. Existentialism says we're not good or evil by nature. Michel de Montaigne said we're the same. Aristotle says the same. This idea that has thousands of years of history, and it's a counter history, for instance, to the Christian view that says that human beings are bad and need salvation. The self is a project. It's not a set in stone thing over and done with in the present. It's a project. It's a throwing forward, literally project, throwing forward into a future. She writes on page 212, in existentialism, on the contrary, the self is not. I exist as an authentic subject in a constantly renewed upspringing that is opposed to the fixed reality of things. I throw myself without help and without guidance into a world where I am not installed ahead of time waiting for myself. I am free, and my projects are not defined by pre-existing interest. They posit their own ends. A couple things to note about that quote. The self is not. Well, we talked about that when we talked about Sartre and being in nothingness and the annihilation of consciousness. The self is not. It's where negation comes into the world, including with its own self. It is not some set thing. It is a possibility. And then she says later, I'm not installed in reality ahead of time waiting for myself. And we brought this question up earlier. Are you trying to find yourself? We use that phrase all the time. I'm really trying to find myself. I want to know who I am. I want to know what I'm for. And when we use that phrase, I want to find myself, the implication is myself is up the road waiting for me. Looking at the watch going, where have you been? I've been here for years. What's been going on? What took you so long to get here? Here I am. Here's you. I am you. Let's get going. She says that's not the way we need to look at ourselves. That we are a freedom, and that we're thrown into our projects, and we throw ourselves into our life with engagement, and we make ourselves as we go. There's not some me up the road waiting for me to get there. And there's a parallel to the Buddhist idea of anatta, this idea of no self. We will talk a little bit more about the relationship between the Buddhist philosophy of life and the existentialist philosophy of life, the parallels and the contrast as we go along. We need other people, according to existentialism. She writes on 213, existentialists are so far from denying love, friendship, and fraternity that in their eyes, the only way for each individual to find the foundation and accomplishment of his being is in these human relationships. That's the only way. But existentialists think they do not consider these feelings as given at first. One must conquer them. And again, what she's trying to say here is, we can only be who we are with the other in love and friendship. And I think there's a real truth to this. But what she would deny is that my soulmate is out there waiting for me to show up. Now, those of you who know me a little bit know that I feel like I have my soulmate. I'm with my soulmate. I've not been embarrassed to talk about that with students. But Beauvoir would say is I didn't find her waiting for me, fully formed in the soulmate relationship, that we made that relationship together. We made that soul mating together. And I think that's an important lesson. If we think, well, there's just somebody for us, that may be true. I mean, that may be very true, but it's not because they're already for you, waiting for you up the road. It's all going to depend on who you become and what your choices are, and what your decisions are, and what your projects for your own life happen to be. And while you're pursuing your own authentic being, the chances are good that you will find the kind of soulmate, the kind of other person who's looking at things in a very simpatico kind of way. So again, this idea that the world is already fated and fated and waiting for us to just find our spot, that would be something that existentialists reject. But in saying that, they're certainly not rejecting love and friendship, and even though they don't use the word, a soulmate, not rejecting that. And, you know, this is one of those places where there is a tension between what the existentialist's view is and what Aristotle's view is. Aristotle says early in the Nicomachean Ethics that human beings are by nature social and political beings. By nature, that's what we are. Modern thought, a big change from the ancient and medieval thought, modern thought sees human beings as individuals first individuals. And then, as individuals, have to decide how to come together, or even if to come together in society. All modern liberal political philosophy, the aforementioned Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, would all end up talking about the social contract, that the best way to understand human beings being together is in terms of a contract, an initial contract. It might be tacit. It's not like there's a sheet of paper somewhere that has the contract written down and everybody's, has signed it, but it's a tacit, implicit contract to be together for certain purposes under certain conditions. That's different from what Aristotle says when he says that human beings are by nature, essentially, in their essence, social political beings, beings of the polis, beings of being together. What the ancient political philosophy wants us to do is figure out how to become ourselves, given that we're social beings. Modern political thought is we are already who we are, and we have to figure out ways that it's beneficial for us to come together in society. Like, what's society for? Those are two opposing projects. Existentialism takes on a little of each one of these. Obviously, it starts with the eigen, with the own. Dasein is in each case mine. Sartre, philosophy starts with the for itself, with consciousness, like any good Cartesian would say. But unlike Descartes, whose philosophies we saw gave rise to this modern dualism between self and world, that split, that gap between self and world is a product of bad philosophical thinking for the existentialists. Heidegger, for instance, showed that we are being in the world with all those hyphens. That's what we are. There's not two things, Dasein and world. Dasein is worldly. World is a Dasein world. So that means we are being with others, being for others. Are, not happen to be, like in modern liberal thought, but we are that way. So it's, again, if you're, especially if you're a philosophy major taking this course, you're looking for something to write about, that's a very interesting topic, the difference between ancient and modern and maybe postmodern, if you want to call it that, ethical and political thought about the relationship between human beings and each other in the world. Death does not negate meaning, as we've seen. In fact, it's the horizon against which meaning makes any sense. Acts take their meaning from freedom engaged in them. Beauvoir and Sartre, as we learned, different from Heidegger on death. Remember, Heidegger says death is my own most possibility. Sartre said death is not a possibility of mine at all. It just doesn't enter into my projects. It's something that's an externality to me. It has nothing really to do with me. Living my life in my being towards death, as Heidegger would say, is all about the projects I have, and the meaning in those projects take their meaning not from some cosmic thing or what's going to happen to me after I pass from this world according to them. They take their meaning from the projects themselves and our responsibility in them. Remember, Sartre wrote, "The perpetual appearance of chance at the heart of my projects cannot be apprehended as my possibility, but on the contrary, as the annihilation of all my possibilities, annihilation which itself is no longer part of my possibilities. Thus, death is not my possibility of no longer realizing a presence in the world, but rather an always possible annihilation of my possibilities, which is outside of my possibilities." In all those words, what he's trying to say is we should not spend a great deal of thought and concern and worry about death, because it will have nothing whatsoever to do with us. Nothing whatsoever to do with us. It's merely, for Sartre, a chance event. It's a chance that's going to happen, but it's a chance event that you can't really factor in very much in the things that you do. Now, again, you can listen to what he says, but you need to appropriate it critically, whether his view or Heidegger's. First of all, are they really different? And second of all, if they are different, there's an important distinction. Which one of them tells us more about ourselves? In many ways, Heidegger's view takes death as that horizon against which all our projects have meaning. It's, for instance, I think it would be easier to understand the principle of life insurance on a Heideggerian point of view rather than Sartrean. But anyway, you can think about that. People think that either virtue is easy or impossible, says Beauvoir, and that's not the way to think about it. You know, if it's easy, if virtue, being the best we can be, is easy, well, then we don't have to worry. Everything's going to be well. It's all going to work out in the end. If virtue is impossible, then, well, it's never going to be as best as it can be, so why worry about it? She says, existentialists think virtue is both possible and difficult. There's many places, again, where Aristotle says that virtue is difficult. He likes this metaphor of archery. When you're shooting a bow and arrow, there's a little bullseye and there's some rings around it, and then the whole target is surrounded by the rest of the world. There's plenty of ways to miss that bullseye, here and there and there and there. There's only one or a few ways to hit that bullseye in the middle of the target, and he says that's really difficult. And he thinks being the best we can be, which he calls virtue, is difficult for us. It's possible, but it's difficult. Some people think it's possible and easy, and then they sort of go through life without thinking about things very much. Other people think that it's not possible at all, and so they don't spend any time. They just live mechanistically. She thinks that existentialism really is at bottom a demanding ethics. Sartre somewhere else said, it's the most demanding ethics, to recognize yourself as freedom, as transcendence in the tension with facticity, in situation, as he says. It's the most demanding ethics. There's no excuses. There's no one you can appeal to with some kind of absolute authority to settle the matters for you. You have to live your life and be responsible for it. So what does one gain by being an existentialist in the end? Beauvoir says, the truth. If you want the truth, being an existentialist is the way to go. That's where you're going to find the truth about us. But the question is, if everything we've been learning so far is the truth, about us, is it good to recognize it? The question is, can we handle the truth? She says, look, truth just is reality. It's not some separate thing over against reality. Like, look, you can't say, well, I just want to stick with reality and I'm not really interested in getting at the truth. She says, well, you can't. They're inseparable from each other. They're two sides of the same coin. You can't elude the truth any more than you can elude reality. Heidegger's whole view of inauthenticity is just a particular common way of dealing with reality, dealing with the truth of ourselves, the truth of ourselves being, for instance, anxiety, and we deal with it by fleeing it. We're not ignoring reality, we're just dealing with it. Metaphor might be like gravity. There's nothing you can do about that. It's a law that operates, as Kant would say, by necessity. It's not like it's just a good idea. You are obeying it. You don't have any choice about it. And even if you say, well, I'm going to go out in outer space, I'm going to float around weightless, you haven't eluded gravity. You've just leveraged it. And that's the same thing with reality/truth. You can't elude it. You could just spin it, so to speak, authentically or inauthentically. So let's wrap this up with a couple of questions that Beauvoir herself raises for us, and you can ask yourselves what you think about what she's saying. In France, you pose problems without resolving them, an American told me one day. We don't pose them, we resolve them. That's us, isn't it? We're not thinkers. We're not a nation of thinkers. We're a nation of doers. Americans haven't been the kind of people who find themselves sitting around wondering about things. We just get busy and we get things done. Now the question is, do we get them done wisely or not? Well, we don't know, because that's not what we do. We don't really live and examine life. So the question is America anti-Socratic? Socrates says one ought to live the examined life. An unexamined life is not worth living, said Socrates. But do we think it's the opposite? Do we think the examined life is not worth living? As a culture, America has not made a profound contribution to the thousands of years old project of seeking wisdom. Really, the only contribution we've made that's of any real significance, I would say, up to this point, is pragmatism, which is a school of thought that started in the early 20th century, and that does have some affinities to existentialism. But for the most part, that's not us. We're doers. So you have to ask yourself, as a person, was Socrates right? Was he right that the unexamined life is not worth living? Or maybe it's the examined life is not worth living? Well, ponder that. Think about that. She also writes on page 217, man cannot escape philosophy because he cannot escape his freedom, which implies questioning and refusal of the given. These essays that she's offering here do not seek to define existentialism once again, but to defend it against the reproach of frivolity and gratuity that has so often been frivolously and gratuitously addressed to all organized thought since Socrates. In truth, there is no divorce between philosophy and life. Do you agree with that? And that's the question that we'll leave it on today. If there's resistance to existentialism, is it because there's resistance to philosophy, which means there's resistance to examining our lives, that we don't want to face up to the Socratic imperative that the unexamined life is not worth living, that we feel we may not be up to the task of examining our lives? Nietzsche said somewhere, it's quoted in your text, about the truth. If we don't like the truth, it's not because we know it's wrong, it's because we're not up to it. And the question here is, are we up to the task of existentialism? Are we up to that task?